It has become something of a tradition, in recent years especially, when reflecting on the year that is coming to an end, to assert that this was definitely the worst year ever. As you may remember, 2016 is forever etched into our memory as the worst year ever, with Brexit and Trump, the Zika virus, the Brussels bombings, among many others, and the death of many beloved musicians and actors. 2017 then was quickly declared even worse. And as we have just seen, 2018 hasn't been so great either, in terms of world events, war, famine, natural disasters, the continued erosion of liberal democracy around the globe, to name but a few of the worrying developments that we are witnessing. So thank God for the royal wedding, I guess. At the same time, whenever it is asserted that this was definitely the worst year ever, others will invariably respond, really? Was it worse than the year of the Spanish flu, the Second World War, or the Black Death? It seems that there is a kind of competition going on for who can identify the worst year in history. Well, I'm happy to report we have a winner. Just last week, a team of scientists have determined that the worst year to be alive was 536 AD. I quote from the report, which was published in Science. A mysterious fog plunged Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia into darkness, day and night, for 18 months. For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during the whole year, wrote Byzantine historian Procopius. Temperatures in the summer fell 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius, initiating the coldest decade in the past 2,300 years. Snow fell in the summer in China, crops failed, people starved. The Irish chronicles record a failure of bread from the years 536 to 39. Then, in 541, the bubonic plague struck the Roman port of Pelusium in Egypt. What came to be called the Plague of Justinian spread rapidly, wiping out 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of the Eastern Roman Empire and hastening its collapse. Yeah. The team, led by Harvard historian Michael McCormick and glaciologist Paul Majewski, analyzed ice from a Swiss glacier and determined that a volcanic eruption in Iceland spewed ash across the northern hemisphere early in 536. Two other massive eruptions followed, and this, along with the plague, plunged Europe into economic stagnation that lasted 100 years. Worst year ever. What I find interesting about this report is the way in which it brings together different forms of memory and ways of knowing about the past. On the one hand, you have the writings of Procopius and the Irish Chronicles, so the historical record. On the other, we have the high-tech analysis of ice core samples, which also preserves a record, which we can now read. And together, these records tell a story of a series of catastrophic events that plunged the world into darkness for a century. I guess there's a reason they call this time the Dark Ages. As you can see, there are various different ways in which something can be etched into our memory and into the memory of our planet. If this research resonates with us today, it is perhaps because many of us feel that we are on the brink of another dark period in history. So if in 536, the defining event that had such an impact on the world was a natural disaster for which no one was to blame, today we're faced with the uncomfortable reality that we are the natural disaster. One of the defining characteristics of this period we are in now is that the distinction between human history and natural history is breaking down. This also changes the way we approach questions of history and memory. And it calls for a rethinking, I would say, of the boundaries between the humanities and the natural sciences. It's not just about the science of analyzing ice or about volcanic activity, but rather it's also about finding out what it was like to be alive during that time. So, what is it like to be alive right now in 2018? And how will we remember 2018? What will remain of this year and of this moment in history in the future? How will future generations remember 2018? My research focuses exactly on the question of how societies remember. What do they choose to commemorate and how? And what do they prefer to forget? Looking at what is remembered and what is forgotten or repressed tells us a lot about how a society thinks about itself, imagines itself, its history and identity. And looking at the development of a society's memory culture can tell you quite a lot about the changing attitudes of that society. So, for example, what are the kinds of things that novels are written about or films made about? And what are the memories that are preserved in museums and monuments? Studying, for example, as I do, how monuments have developed can tell you a lot about the changing function of memory in a culture. For example, up until the 19th and early 20th century, memorials were mostly heroic, commemorating victories, conquests, famous or infamous statesmen or monarchs. You get the guy on a horse or the guy next to a horse statues, right? You've seen them. Triumphal columns and arches or grandiose buildings. Then in the aftermath of World War I and World War II, the Holocaust, Hiroshima, memorials changed completely. Now they commemorate victimhood, absence, trauma, loss. And they look increasingly abstract, broken up, unfinished. Their forms are anti-monumental. Some of them vanish over time. Others are sunk into the ground or can only be seen from a particular angle. They can even be little engraved cobblestones on the street marking the absence of a person who died in the Holocaust. All of these monuments are about making the past visible in the present. Now, however, we are beginning to see yet another kind of memorial emerge, a memorial that aims to make the future present and visible. An example of this would be the proposed memorial to global warming in Washington, D.C., which will let the famous cherry trees of Washington be submerged by the rising water of the Potomac River over the course of several decades. Of course, you might say that every memorial is built for the future, so that future generations will see that something important happened here and that they will remember that we existed. But what is different now, perhaps, is that the future itself has become uncertain and that it is not so clear who will remember us when we're gone, or that there will be someone to remember us a few hundred years from now at all. So the function of these memorials is to remind us of the future and to spur us to take action now in order to make sure that there is a future. Thank you.